This week we're going to start with body composition and nutrition for sport. But we're also going to add in calculating caloric needs, basal metabolic rate, and resting metabolic rate. All right, assessing body composition. So some of the sources of key information are the height and weight, but as we've discussed many times before, height and weight is not enough to know fitness status. That's good enough to get a BMI, but a BMI is not actually reliable for anyone that's outside the normal population. It's a lot better if we know the percent body fat, and we already know that high percent body fat tends to correlate highly to low performance. But more importantly, if you know the percent body fat, you know the percent of lean muscle, so you can figure out how much of the actual athlete is in there underneath the body fat. So we have a lot of different ways that we measure body fat. One we do here at the university is densometry with the hydrostatic weighing, where we put you into the water tank, use the Archimedes principle, and determine your body density and put that into a formula to determine your body fat. It's considered the gold standard. It's good for about 2% within 2% reliability. DEXA, which is dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, is where you use a radiation, basically like a assessing body composition. So some of the sources of key information, the easy ones to use, of course, are height and weight, but that's not actually enough to know fitness status. It's enough to calculate BMI, but that's only going to be good for your average population of low to recreational gym users. What's a little better is if you know body percent fat, because we know that high body percent fat correlates to low performance. Or more importantly, if you know the body percent fat, then you can subtract and figure out the fat-free mass. And the fat-free mass is the actual athletic potential built in there, because that is your lean muscle, your skeletal, your water, and the things minus the fat. The fat just adds a lot of extra weight you have to carry around. So there's several ways to measure body fat. Densometry, hydrostatic weighing, which we have a lab here at the university. DEXA, dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. Air plasmography, which is the BOD-POD. Skin folds, which we have plenty of those as well. And bioelectric impedance, which if you have one of those little handhold devices, doesn't really do much of anything, but there are some high dollar items that you can stand on and hold the hand units and foot units that are pretty reliable. All right, so densometry. This is a way of using the Archimedes principle of water displacement, and it allows you to figure out the density of the body, and then you can put that into a formula with known densities of fat mass, lean mass, and bone mass, and you can calculate the actual fat mass versus the non-fat mass based on the density that you get from water weighing. The principle is you put somebody in a water tank, you weigh them in the water. They're going to usually only weigh 3-4 kilos, something like that. You weigh them on the land. You take their height. You put it into a pretty complex formula, and it spits out a fat mass that's good to within 2%. Muscle, and of course bone, is heavier than water, so it's going to sink. Fat is lighter than water, so it's going to raise. So it's actually possible that when you weigh somebody in the water, they can actually have a negative weight. It says this is the most commonly used method. It was the most commonly used method. It's not anymore. Simple reason is, the biggest reason at least, is it's pretty inconvenient. You have to fill up a huge tank. It takes an hour to fill up. Then you have to get someone to not be afraid to get in the water and to dunk themselves under the water. Plus you have to be able to push all the air out of your lungs while you're in the water. Otherwise, that air is going to confound the variable and it's going to come up as fat mass. So the limitations on it, the biggest one is going to be that lung air volume. It's going to throw off the formula and it's going to be a conversion problem. But personally, the biggest ones I've seen is human errors. People can have a tendency to be afraid to actually dunk themselves underwater and hold themselves underwater while you measure them. So getting people in the tank and getting people to completely submerge tends to be your biggest issue. This is a picture of it. We have one on the bottom floor of VHAC. Basically what he's doing is as close to where the issue is. Luckily, he's pretty far down there. What you'll find most of the time when people do this is they'll put their face in the water, but they won't get their whole back and their head under the water. And when you don't get yourself fully submerged, you don't get a good weighing. DEXA, dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. This is where you take an X-ray that shoots a low amount of radiation, and it shoots it through you into a table, and the table measures how long it took that X-ray to get there, and it knows how long it takes to travel through fat, how long it takes to travel through bone, how long it takes to travel through muscle. Plus, it's already got a accurate scan of your entire outer torso, and it also has your weight because there's a scale built into the table. So it uses all these, and then it extrapolates your body fat, it extrapolates your bone density, it extrapolates everything. It's very, very good. This is the gold standard that everybody goes to now. The problem is a cheap DEXA starts around 50, 60,000, and then the ones that are good enough to do fat mass tend to start you around 120, 130,000. So they're very, very rare. Plus you have to have somebody licensed in radiology to do them, and you have to have an X-ray room and the vests and all of the different licensing. So it's a very big investment that very few people want to make. Air plasmography, BOD-POD. This is almost as good as DEXA. I mean, it's within decimal points. This is pretty much the standard that you're going to see at a university. They're about 50, 60, 70,000, but they're super, super reliable. It uses the exact same principle as the underwater tank, but instead of you displacing water, you displace a set amount of air that it fills into this egg chamber. So instead, when that air is displaced, it uses the amount of air that was displaced to calculate that density. It's very easy to use. It says it's difficult for the operator, but it's actually not. It's pretty simple once you get trained. And all the subject has to do is wear some compression tight clothing, wear a swim cap, sit in there for about 30 seconds, and jump out. The only issue you run into is some people get a little claustrophobic. This is a picture of a DEXA machine. Basically, you just align the person correctly up on the table. They lay there, and the arm above them goes back and forth a couple of times, scanning the entirety of the body. And then it gives you a printout that shows you all of your different fat mass, your BMI, your bone mineral mass, your body water, everything. This is just one of the first printouts it'll give you. It shows you all your dimensions, and you can see your skeleton, but you can also see your fat mass and your muscle mass when you look at it. The darker white is actually your muscle, and then if you look, you can see particularly around this person, looks like a female's hips. The lighter material on the side, the up around the triceps, the shoulders, and the hip area you can see, that's actually fat mass. So it's that darker black area is fat mass covering the muscle mass. So skin folds are about the most widely used technique. Why? They're super cheap. You can get a little plastic caliper for just a few dollars. What you do is you measure thickness at a minimum of 3 sites. There are 3 separate sites for men versus women, or 7 sites, which are the same 7 for both sexes. 7, of course, is just a much, much more accurate way. One, you've checked more areas, so if you've made a mistake, there's more room to cover that error back up. Are reasonably accurate. Reasonably accurate is a very relative term in this one. if you do plenty of them, they're very accurate. For one of my grant projects, we had to do, I think it was about 900 different people. When it first start out, your skin folds are ridiculous. Everybody's either super fat or super thin and nowhere in between. After you do about 200 or 300 of them, they're pretty accurate. And after about 400 or 500 of them, you'll find that they're almost the same numbers as the Bod Pod. So if you're really experienced with them, they're very accurate. But you have to do many, many, many of them before then. Bioelectrical impedance. This is those little devices, the scales that you buy, the handhold items that you get, where it puts a little bit of electricity through you, and then it tests how long it takes the electricity to get back, and that tells it roughly how much fat mass you have. How good are they? Really depends. If you've got a little $25, $50 Omron handheld scanner, they're just as good as taking a random guess. The scales that you buy, the good scales that are about $100, $150, if they're pretty reliable, they can be within 2 or 3%. But a lot of it's going to be very, very dependent on your hydration levels. The higher dollar ones that start about $600, $700, and you have to stand and hold the 4 different points while it goes around you, those are usually good to about 2%. They're almost as good as Bod Pods and DEXA scanners. This is just a picture of skin folds due to the triceps, and this is usually why people are very bad at it. He's actually doing a pretty good job, but as you can see, he's grabbed a deep pinch that's probably relatively painful to the person doing it. When people usually do it, they want to be very nice. They take these little baby pinches. They don't want to pinch the skin too hard, and they don't want to pull it and separate it away from the muscle. To get a true accurate skin fold, you have to kind of be mean about it, because being polite is nice, but it's not reliable. You get terrible numbers. This is one of the good BIA devices I was talking about. In this one, you can see that there's the panels on the ground, but there's also those hand sensors. So somebody would do is they stand on that, and then they hold their hands out to their side while holding those devices. And that way it can run the electrical impedance in multiple directions at a time, and it can do a pretty good job assessing your body structure. Okay, now that we talked about how to actually analyze fat-free mass and fat mass using different instrumentation, I'm going to go ahead and shoehorn a little section in here on energy and nutrition, since we're not doing an entire section or teaching an entire class on metabolics. These are the 2 biggest metabolic equations that you can use to actually figure out your caloric needs. The 2,000 calorie recommended a day thing is super generic and generally garbage. And most people that are at those numbers are nowhere near what the people in this program would be. So there's 2 big ones, the basal metabolic rate and the resting metabolic rate. The difference is whether or not you actually know your fat-free mass or if you're just going to guesstimate. The resting metabolic rate uses only height and weight, and the basal metabolic rate uses true measured fat-free mass. The basal metabolic rate, of course, is much more accurate because if you know your fat-free mass, you can calculate your energy needs very, very accurately. Resting metabolic rate is going to be goodish, but it's your BMI of metabolic equations. All right, so you can see the 2 are here. The catch formula for basal metabolic rate is very simple. It's only 31.2 times fat-free mass. We don't care what your height is. We don't care what your weight is. We don't care what your sex is. It doesn't matter, because fat-free mass has a set energy burn. It doesn't matter if you're a 4-foot female, if you're 7'8", NFL linebacker. It's just pure based on that fat-free mass. The one below it has 2 formulas, one for males, one for females, and it takes into account your weight, your height, your age, and of course your gender based on that equation. This one's pretty good, but once again, it's going to be generic. It's going to assume that there's an equal fat ratio to the whole population. It's going to assume that you're not over musculature, because it doesn't have any choice but to assume these things. All right, the utilization for this. So you could take this, and BMR, RMR is basically your energy you use to be alive. It's not your total energy by a long shot, but it's the energy you have if you just did nothing but lay around in bed and needed to be not dead. So on top of that, you're going to need to calculate your total energy effect. And this is going to be that basal metabolic rate plus that thermal effect of food, which is how much of the calories from food are burned just to break down that food. And then, of course, your activities of daily living. This is the simple version of just putting it together. You could do a multiple step one, but this is an easy one. Okay, thermal effect for food. We don't use it with RMR because the RMR kind of already assumes that it's in there. But basal does not. So all you would do is you would take your total calories you consume every day, you multiply it by 0.1. So if you have a 2,000 calorie diet, you're burning 200 calories to break down that diet. And then if you want to, there's some more math you can put into it. Thermal effect of protein. Protein is very complicated to break down. I believe I've taught you before that the actual calories on protein is something like 5.1, 5.2 kcals per gram, but we report it as 4.1 because 20% of it's lost already trying to break it down. Carbohydrates, a lot easier to break down. I mean, it also depends though if you're talking about simple versus complex sugars. And then fats don't even have to break down. If we don't use them, we have a very great storage system for them. So they have a very low thermal effect for food. And then following daily activities and stress factors, you're going to want to add in the amount of work you do on a daily basis. This counts exercising, working out, or job-related activities. But it's going to be that total energy that you need to maintain those calories. So these calculations will tell you basically your break-even point for calories. The golden rule is if you want to lose a pound a week, you take this final calculation, you subtract 500 a day, that's a pound a week. You add 500 a day, you gain a pound a week. All right, so if you're a sedentary person, little no exercise, little job effort more than maybe a simple desk job, 1.2 times that RMR calculation. And anywhere it says RMR, you just substitute BMR plus TEF. Mild activity level, somebody that works out 20 minutes 1 to 3 times a week doing, medium aerobic stuff, bicycling, jogging, basketball, swimming, skating, whatever. If you do that regularly, or even if you don't exercise regularly, but you have a pretty busy lifestyle that requires you to walk a lot, long periods, then you would count for this. This counts for people typically in the work sector. It's teachers, nurses, people that just tend to be up walking around a lot. If they have that kind of job and they don't work out, then you would take their RMR level, multiply it by 1.375. Moderate activity level, this is somebody that works out pretty intense, 30 to 60 minutes a week, 3 to 4 times a week, or has a job that's pretty structured. Not up to heavy construction, but maybe working around a lot of machines, mechanics, things like that. So you take their activity level, multiply by 155. And then somebody that's heavy labor intensive, somebody that works 60 minutes, 5 to 7 days a week. I mean, you're starting to look up towards bodybuilders, power lifters, pretty big guys at this stage. And they have labor intensive jobs that are things like labor, carpentry, bricklayers, just, you know, farming's on here, but take farming with an asterisk. This doesn't count like modern farming where you can sit and ride in the tractor, but more of the old style farming where you're actually out and you have to do a lot of manual labor. Landscapers, anything like that. So take that number, multiply it by 1.7. An extreme, this is pretty much the bananas category. These should only be a couple of people, and most of them should be Olympians. It has things on here like people that shovel coal all day, but once again, machine era has come around. Works crazy hours on an assembly line, but it also has to be non-machined. That's the 1.9. But the only people that should run into that is you're going to run into your high-level Olympians, high-level professional athletes, world power lifters, and occasionally psychopathic CrossFitters. All right, so body competition in sport and sport performance. So fat-free mass, which is including your muscle, of course. It's muscle, it's bone, it's water. It's all the things that you would have if you stripped away your actual fat stores. So knowing these are very valuable for athletes to know. If you have really good power and strength and endurance, but you have a whole lot of fat, then you're never going to show that power, because if you're able to, let's say, jump and carry 600 pounds off the ground of force, and you're already weighing 300 pounds, you've just stripped half your power away. So the less fat mass you have, the better you're able to turn that absolute force into relative force. And also it's very bad for aerobic endurance for the same reason of it's very uneconomical to run around with a lot of extra weight. Even if you took your world's best marathon runners, give them a backpack full of rocks, they're not going to run very far. Relative body weight, which is that percent body fat. So fat, it listed as dead weight. It's not. It does actually have some endocrine functions too. But it is very useful for storage. Less fat mass is usually better for performance. Usually. Obvious exceptions. Sumo wrestlers are a given. They're using their weight to throw each other around. He who has the most mass is the hardest guy to move. So when you're only in a small circle making very small steps, then it helps to be a big guy. Swimmers, they don't want too much, but they do want some. And the reason is, if you don't have any fat, you tend to sink easy. It's that whole Archimedes part back again. If you have a little bit or enough body fat, you can make yourself neutrally buoyant, where you won't sink and you won't float, but you'll just be kind of gliding through the water at a neutral buoyancy. And then if you have too much fat, the problem is you float so much that you actually cause water resistance. So there's a limit in there. A weightlifter, it's not necessarily that fat helps weightlifters. It's more like weightlifters and powerlifters just don't care. Whenever they cut fat, they lose muscle, and their job is to stack muscle for their entirety of their life. So they will always eat a lot. They will always be big guys, and that's fine because they just want to be, perma-bulked. So what are the weight standards and how are they in sports? They give you guides for optimal body size and composition for sport. Are they misleading? Yeah, they're misleading. Elite athletes define optimal performance. Do they define optimal bodies? Not necessarily. Why? Because there's a whole lot of times that if people knew the fat-free mass versus just trying to make weight, they would be much better performers. And the reason that the professional athletes throw this off so badly is how they do weigh-ins versus how amateurs do weigh-ins. A professional that has to do a weigh-in will do a massive starvation cut 2, 3, 4, 5 days before an event. So when they come in, they can be 20, 30 pounds under their competition weight. But it's fine because they have many days to rehydrate and to bulk back up and to eat back up and to go into their boxing match, wrestling match, MMA, whatever, and be back at their normal size. If you ever want to see how big they change, look at them on fight day and look at them on weigh-in day. On weigh-in day, they are cut like sharks. Amateurs weigh in minutes before they compete. So if you're trying to make a weight that you're not supposed to be at, all you're really doing is running yourself in there dehydrated, all this underweight, and just really weak. When you could have fought 2 or 3 pounds heavier, 5 pounds heavier at the most, been one more weight class up, and been 20% stronger because of the dehydration. So it's much better to find out what's your fat-free mass and then calculate where you should be in a competition based off of that number. Weight composition is a sport, inappropriate use of weights. This is abused by coaches a lot because, as a general rule, a lot of coaches don't use a lot of science, unfortunately. They just kind of pick arbitrarily and go, I want you in the 161 wrestling class. I need a guy at 161, you're it. Doesn't matter what his body composition is, so he decides that that guy should be at 161 and makes him gain or lose till he fits it. And then there's a misconception. If you lose a little bit of weight, that's good. If you lose a ton, it's better. Not if you go into all your performances with no energy, you're dehydrated, and you're unable to perform because your musculature is not responding properly, your electrolytes are out of balance, your energy system's out of whack, and it causes a lot of issues. Plus, it can cause a lot of things like eating disorders, and that's for men and women. Wrestlers are notorious for eating disorders, especially in the low weight classes. And then when you have to make weight, people do the water cut diets. They do a lot of diets, lose 20, 30 pounds to try to make a certain class. Then when you go into your competition, you're in such bad shape that your performance is bad. But it continuously happens because both sides of the fence are doing it. All right, dehydration, fasting, extreme caloric restriction, water loss, using distilled water, things like that. So you lose 2 to 4% water loss is pure water, and if you lose 2 to 4% of your water, you've impaired your performance already. You lose enough, you get kidney death, you get cardiovascular dysfunction, you get permadeath. So once you start cutting too much water, you're already in trouble. Chronic fatigue, you get underweight, then you get fatigue. You get fatigue, you get low performance, you get injuries. And this is going to mimic the same thing that happens when you get into burnout syndromes. You get the overtraining, you get chronic fatigue syndrome. Girls can get the triad. Pretty much, you can knock everything out. Men, your testosterone level can just go to 0, and you're pretty much done. So what is the female athletic triad? This is one that's notorious in people like gymnasts. This is when you are going to have issues with eating, with menstrual function, and you're going to get bone disorders. So you see it a lot in lean physique, low body weight, and endurance sports. Specifically, skate, dance, gymnasts, running, swimming. What isn't on here, and it doesn't explain as well, is because a lot of these particular female athletes, skaters, dancers, gymnasts especially, start at such an early age, they typically do this before puberty. And because of this, they never actually have puberty. They will never actually grow boobs or hips. They will never have menstruation. They will never hit reproductive functioning for the rest of the time that they continue this condition. So when they're not eating enough and they're doing high level gymnastics and things, a lot of them will never even have their first period or hit their ability to grow breasts and hips until they have retired from gymnastics in their mid-20s. On top of this, you get a lot of disordered nutritions. Their weight standards become skewed and they start disordered eating. It creates conditions like anorexia nervosa, the one where you just don't eat at all, and bulimia nervosa, which is the one where you binge and purge. It's more prevalent with women in lean sports, but you'll also run into a lot with men, specifically in competition sports when they're on the low side of the weight classes, that 150 under class. All right, menstrual dysfunctions. So what do we have that can happen to people that are undereating? You can have delayed menarche, which means you never got that first period to start with. Oligomenorrhea, this is random, sporadic periods. So maybe you have one this month, maybe you don't. But more than half of the year, you don't. And amenorrhea. This is just the complete cessation of someone who's already started puberty, but maybe got into swimming or something competitively, and all of a sudden all of her periods are gone. While that probably sounds great to a lot of girls, it also comes with the problem of the reason it's stopping, and that is the fact that your hormone system is going out of whack and your estrogen levels are also going out of whack. But once again, prevalent low body weight sports, and it's due to just not having enough calories. Your body's going to pick its most important functions. Being alive is important. Having babies is not important. So it's going to sacrifice the ability to reproduce pretty quickly. After that comes fun things like bone mineral loss. If you're not giving yourself enough minerals through your diet, then it's going to start ripping out the stores it has. Because we have such important needs for calcium, like our muscular contractions and our heartbeat, we're going to have to keep that calcium going. So we're just going to take it away from your bones. So if you've got someone who's got like athletic amenorrhea, who stopped her periods, who's not taking in enough food, who's hit that level, then you see somebody who's like anorexia on top of that, they're going to have fracture rates that are 7 times higher than a normal person. When you also take into effect that these people are doing things like gymnastics, there's going to be a lot of broken bones. So appropriate weight standards. We have inappropriate standards most of the time, and they're risky for athletic health. We should be working on body composition, not body weight. Unfortunately, that's not what we tend to do. We should be checking people to see if they're in an optimal range of percent body fat and in that athletic range for the athletes. And you should have to recognize there are sex differences. Girls have higher body fat than guys. That's just the standard. And you shouldn't try to force the females to be so low on the weight standard to get, a little bit extra pole vaulting that they end up putting themselves in health risks. And why are weight standards not appropriate? Because it's just a technical measurement. First of all, you're just measuring somebody based on their gravity effect at where they are in sea level. It doesn't tell you anything about their musculature. It doesn't tell you anything about their athletic performance. The famous gymnast Simone, if you see her, she doesn't have the typical ideal levels for most gymnasts. She has huge thighs, she has huge shoulders, but she is all big and all muscle, and she's also a gold gymnast. Meanwhile, most of the other gymnasts were half as big as her and got squashed. So achieving optimal weight. Obviously, you want to avoid fasting, crash diets. Why? Because this is going to cause mostly water and muscle loss, not fat. When your body goes into starvation, it wants to get rid of everything that's not needed. Just the same way that your body will, or a female body will, isolate reproduction and cease those functions. It's also going to look at the amount of muscle you have and realize muscle costs a lot of calories, so we don't need it. So let's just go ahead and eat the muscle. We'll burn it into calories, and then we'll spend less later. So from a survival point, having no muscle is good for your body. So if you don't feed it, you're going to eat it. Ketosis, that's where you're running a high-fat, high-protein, low-carb diet, mostly high-fat. This will also accelerate a lot of water loss because your body is learning to eat fat. This on itself is actually not a bad thing, especially if it's more of a permanent style diet. In short bursts, it can be chaotic because you're switching energy systems back and forth, but long term, it works very well actually. So what is optimal fat loss? Well, it's where you're going to lose fat mass, but maintain free fat mass. You're not able to do both at the same time, but what you can do is hopefully in that 80-20 ratio, where when it's time to bulk up, you gain 80% fat-free mass and lose, or gain 80% fat-free mass and gain 80% fat. But then when you go to burn off weight, you burn off 80% fat and only 20% fat-free mass. And how you do that? Moderate caloric restrictions and exercise, of course, is what we normally do. The golden rule, they say 200, 250 to 500 kcals a day. And this is going to lose 250 will lose you a half a pound. 500 will lose you 1 pound. The book actually has a mistake in here. It's not a kilogram. It's a pound. Because 3,500 calories, which is 500 times 7, being 7 a week, is equal to 1 pound of fat mass. And whenever you start to get closer to your weight loss goal, you're going to see that it's going to slow down. Why? Because when you're getting more and more fat loss, your body starts to wonder if there is maybe some starvation coming. So those last couple pounds, it's going to want to hold on to more and more because we might need it for that long winter. So classification of nutrients, recommended nutrient balance. Carbohydrates, it should be generally about half your diet, a little bit above half, 55, 60%. Fat, about 35%. Protein, 10 to 15% is usually decent. There's some rules on this though that you want to maintain. Carbohydrate and protein based on grams per kilo, 1.2 to 1.7 grams per kilogram. Some of the bigger bodybuilders and stuff want that a little bit higher though. They'll put it in that 2.2, which just happens to be what a kilogram weighs. So 2.2 grams per kilo in the easy math is the same as 1 gram per 1 pound. And then carbs, 3 to 12 grams. This is a pretty big range, but this is going to be that range based on what kind of athlete am I. If you're a runner, yeah, you're going to be pushing that 12 side. If you're a power athlete, 3 is not even that important. It's just all about, are you an endurance athlete? Are you a power athlete? How much do you train and work? I mean, if you make one lift every 5-6 minutes and you only do 4 lifts at a competition, you don't need much. If you're playing sports that have a lot of power, you'll be somewhere in that middle. If you're a track runner, you're going to be really high. So the RDA, outdated is what it says. Not bad, just insufficient. I will disagree with that pretty profusely. It's bad. It's always been bad, and it's known to be bad. The RDA themselves do not endorse their own recommendations. The problem is there was a whole big controversy when they lowered the salt and lowered the sugar, and a major company that was in charge of children's lunches at high schools, lobbied them to presidential issues, and they ended up doubling their own requirements just so that the foods they were serving were allowed to be in schools. It's a huge controversy, lots and lots of documents about it. It's a pretty famous thing. But unfortunately, they knowingly put out daily allowances that were considered unhealthy by them. Which also brings in that daily recommended intake, which is also based off of those. The numbers they're pretty poor. I mean, the sodium numbers and some of those electrolyte numbers are crazy. What's better is to figure out your own nutritional needs, figure out those protein grams, those fat grams, and work your own nutritional analysis. So classification of nutrients. We all know there's 3 substrates. Carbs, which we say as 4 kcals per gram. Fat at 9 kcals per gram. Protein, we also say is 4 kcals per gram. But there is actually a 4th substrate, which is Mr. Alcohol. Alcohol has 7 kcals per gram. Why is that good to know? Well, for one reason, those shots of whatever you're taking add up really fast. So that is calories that you need to put into your daily intake. The reason it's left out of a lot of nutrition, it has some nasty beta effects and some toxicity where it can, of course, it passes that blood-brain barrier and causes some starvation in your brain. So alcohol basically has the same effect as sniffing paint on your brain. So it can be bad to advertise it as one of the 4 major food groups, but it actually is. Vitamins and minerals, they have many, many different functions in your body. Depends on the vitamin and mineral itself. But as far as calories, they actually have 0. So classification of nutrients for the carbohydrates. Most everything is going to be broken down. You're primarily going to monosaccharides. And the one we use the most, of course, is glucose. Disaccharide is just 2 monos. Poly just means many. So fructose, galactose, which is sugars from milk, fructose from fruits. All of these are different types that will add up. Sucrose is a table sugar, is a combination of the two. What's the main purpose? It's the energy source for your nervous system, particularly your brain. Your brain and your spinal cord live in a fluid of pure sugars. It's so sugary that if we need to test you for a skull fracture, you just use a glucometer. If you test the blood and it comes up as normal glucose, then it's just regular blood. If it comes up as high and untestable, then you know that you have cerebral spinal fluid in there. Also, excessive carbohydrates, we store it as the glycogen, right? 500 kcals or so of glucose is made into glycogen, stored in your livers. That's that emergency reserve of energy you need when your glucose level drops and your blood sugar is too low. And how much we store is quite determined pretty much by how much you're intaking. If you're taking in enough that you're filling all your needs, then you're going to keep your stores at full capacity. If you're not taking in enough, those stores are going to stay low. So what determines the need for glycogen replacement? How much carbohydrates you intake. Also, your exercise. Are you doing eccentric work, which is going to cause a drop in your glycogen synthesis? Are you doing a lot of cardio? Are you doing powerlifting? How much you're using? What kind of energy system? All of these are going to have factors. So what is glycogen maintenance? 3 to 12 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight per day. This is not normally something you need to control. Your body's pretty good at telling you. Whether you need 3 or 12 is going to be dependent on athleticism. What kind of athlete are you? If you're playing basketball, you'll need more. If you're playing football, you'll need a little bit. If you're a track star, you're probably going to need all of it. But the good thing is, you normally don't have to measure it because your hunger forces a drive for carbohydrates. Whenever your blood glucose level drops and whenever your brain senses that the sugar level around it is lower, it causes a hard craving for carbohydrates. Particularly, you're going to find most of the athletes are wanting bunches of bread. So whenever you find yourself massively craving breads, it's usually because your carb levels are too low. And whenever you do have low carb levels, and assuming you're on a standard diet, not a ketogenic diet, then you're going to find yourself feeling really heavy, sluggish, tired, and after a while, stupid, unable to make rational decisions. Why? Because your brain lives in sugar. So if it doesn't have that sugar, you're not going to do as well on that test. So this is a nice little graph of a low carbohydrate diet and a high carbohydrate diet, and just showing what happens after repeated training bouts. So about what you would think. In the beginning, it's okay because they're both having enough when they're kind of at a resting. So they do that first bout, and the guy with the low carb and the high carb, they go to the same level. But then, because he is artificially bringing back, the high carb guy is going to jump way back up. And he's going to be able to maintain almost the same level all the way across the board. The low carb guy is working off of gluconeogenesis, which is turning proteins and fats and things into sugars. So he's not adapting as fast. So every single bout, he's lower and lower and lower, and is not able to get that sugar level back up. This is just a little point graph. What it's showing you is that the high carb diet starts off with a lot more sugar in his muscles, which means he has more sugar to pull from. So that way he has a higher energy store for later. So in the end, he starts off with a little over 200 millimoles per kilogram of glucose in his muscles. So he's able to work out for almost 200 minutes before he wears out. The guy at the normal diet, having an average amount of intake, starts off with about 100 millimoles per kilogram in his muscles, gives him a little bit better storage than the low carb guy, but he's still only got about 100 minutes. And then the low carb guy, he takes in a little over 50. He can only work in a little over 50. So virtually the amount of millimoles per kilograms of glucose you're storing is the amount of minutes you can work out before exhaustion. So glycemic index is a food category we use. This is how we measure blood sugar responses. If you have something that's like very sugary, sports drinks, candy, jelly beans, fried potatoes, cornflakes, this is going to cause a very high spike in your glycemic index. This can be good and bad. If you're really, really low, this is going to give you that quick, fast reaction to getting your blood sugar back up. Great for diabetics. The side effect of it is it's also going to cause those insulin spikes and going to cause that to be stored quickly. So it's going to cause it to go back down as fast as it goes up. Moderate, something like pastries, pita breads, different breads, bananas, some sodas, ice cream, things that are a little bit longer to digest. These are good follow-ups. They'll be slower to get your blood sugar up, but they'll steady it out. And then your low GI is going to be spaghettis, legumes, milk, apples, pears, peanuts, M&Ms, yogurt. Peanut butter is a favorite of a lot of diabetics. These take a lot longer to break down and burn out, but they keep your sugar steady. If you're running into diabetics who have problems with low sugars, you'll find out they normally like to keep a high item with them and a low item with them. So a peanut butter sandwich and a candy bar is a pretty common thing. GI is not perfect. None of the tests are, though. So individual responses vary. Some people respond high to simple sugars. There are people that respond quite low to it. It's not common. It's great for the majority of people, but not for everybody. If it's a medical case, you'd want to get checked individually, but otherwise, when you're thinking on the athletic side, it's fine as a general overall. There are complex carbohydrates that do have high GIs. Rice is a good example. It's a pretty fast burning complex carb. Fat plus a high glycemic index will lower your glycemic index. Sounds confusing, but what happens is you've put so much substrate in that there's now competition, and your body is looking at that fat and trying to put that fat away, and the insulin is grabbing the sugars along with the fats and causing storage. And GI calculations differ on reference food. So some of this is put out by the companies that make it. Some of it's because of different composition. But the glucose in different breads can be dynamically different and cause different GI indexes. What is an improved carbohydrate index? So if you really wanted to calculate this out, you could take your glycemic index and turn it into the GI response times the carbohydrates in grams and divide by 100. So some carbohydrate factors that increase over exercise time. Normal glycemia and low GI pre-exercise snacks. Carbohydrate loading. If you're doing an event that requires to have a lot of energy, it's a good idea to start. It says 1 to 3, but a lot of marathoners and extremists will go 3 and 5 days. So you start carb loading so that your muscles have their highest amount of glucose storage. Carbohydrate feeding during exercise. Those little sports packs, gel packs, things that are very low weight but are complex and mid-level sugars. They're really good to keep your blood glucose up. And there are some things that will also decrease over exercise time. So you can run into hypoglycemia, which is anything if you start with any kind of like high GI pre-exercise snacks. So you start with a whole lot of candy, sugar, jelly beans as your pre-exercise. You run out there, it's good for about 20, 30 minutes, and then the insulin kick comes, drags all the sugar out, plus the fact you're burning more, and you're going to end up hypoglycemic. If you didn't carb load, you came out with empty muscle stores, then you have no stores to pull from and your glucose can't go back up. And if you're not taking any glucose supplements on your way, then you're going to have that same problem. All the sugar's gone and there's nothing to replace it. So here's a graph about that sugar loading right before you work out. This is under the assumption that you're using kind of a simplistic sugar, candy bar, jelly bean. I think these people were actually tested with sugar. So 45 minutes before time starts, they're intended to exercise for 90 minutes. So they're given an amount of sugar, blood glucose concentration shown, right? So they're tested until their sugar is 80 if you're on the pre-sugar feeding guy. They were all about the same, 78 to 80. So the sugar was raised to 120 milligrams per deciliter from one group, which is at the 0 mark. They started working out, and you can see in 15 minutes, his glucose went from 120 to 43, which is almost passing out. After that, he was able to maintain and get a little bit of a bounce back from his natural stores until 75 minutes where the group would quit and nobody was even able to finish the 90 minutes exercise. Meanwhile, the group that did no sugar and just came in natural were able to get that natural glucose response, which you saw in the other group between minutes 15 and 75. But instead of needing that emergency spike, they used it as a steady state to raise their sugar from about 78 up to about 95 at one point. And they were able to finish all 90 minutes of exercise before they were exhausted. So carbohydrates during exercise, unlike pre-exercise carbohydrates, they do not trigger hypoglycemia. They improve muscle permeability to glucose and insulin binding sites already altered during exercise. Why is there question marks on that? Because maybe not. There's research out, but it's not very conclusive and it's not been very repeated yet. But maybe they cause your muscles to like glucose more if you're already working out, and maybe they cause those insulin binding sites to be a little calmer. But the point of that is, once you're working out, once you're in the middle of that run, once you're in the middle of that marathon, once you hit that 10-15 minute marker, you can go ahead and start popping those sugar packs, those gel packs, and you won't cause a spike, or you won't cause that spike and drop. You'll just cause a slow, steady gain. So carbohydrate intake after exercise is essential, especially if you're doing those 2-hour runs. After that, you're going to hit that wall. Unless you're on some kind of ketogenic diet where you run purely on fat, you're going to run out of sugar, and your body is not accustomed to running off of fat supplies. So protein and carbohydrates together will intake enhances glycogen stores. What does that mean? That if you're taking just the carbs and you add a little bit of protein powder or some kind of protein supplement with them, it will cause your body to store more carbs inside your muscles for those runs later. And this will also help stimulate and your muscle tissue repair. So pre-recovery, if you're doing protein powder with sugar in it, something most people try desperately to get rid of, is actually quite good because it helps stimulate the movement of those amino acids to those repair sites to cause that musculature growth. So this is a kind of a poor bar graph, which should be a scatter graph, but what it's showing is the glycogen synthesis is on the y-axis. That is your ability to create those sugars and to store them, to get them back to your muscles. And then the minutes of recovery is just how long after you've been exercising. So the first 2 hours and the next 2 hours. So in red is people that took carbs immediately after exercise, and blue is people that took carbs 2 hours after exercise. What it's showing you is if you take carbs right after you exercise, you are going to be creating a lot of sugars to store back to your muscles, 3 times more than if you were waiting. And then in the middle, or the second group, they look equal, like it looks like the carbs levels have gone down on the red. The reason it goes down on the red is because the reds have already pretty much filled your muscles back up. The blue is just now starting to get up to the level to store them sugars. Okay, now on to fats. Fats are essential for body functions. One, they can work as a fuel substrate. Triglycerides turn into free fatty acids plus glycerol. They're also components of cell membranes and nerve fibers, and they're required by all steroid hormones and all fat-soluble vitamins. So there's 2 types of fats. You have saturated and unsaturated. The total fat should be less than 35% of the total daily kilocalories, and trans fat is pretty much always the devil. Saturated fat, you want it to be less than 10%. It's a much less healthy fat. One is because of the way the bonds work. If you're into the organic chemistry, there's a double bond in there. It's a lot harder to break up. And you want to keep your cholesterol below 300 milligrams a day. Free fatty acids are important fuel during exercise. We all remember the whole beta oxidative cycle. It runs completely on fat. The most important part of that being the fact your heart is a type 1 beta oxidative muscle. So if you don't have enough fat, eventually your heart would quit. Luckily, that seems to never be a problem, and I don't think any Americans have that problem. But daily exhaustion after glycogen depletion, this is when your free fatty acid systems kick in. Your body cannot metabolize a triglyceride. What it has to do is it breaks down those triglycerides into free fatty acids, and then it can feed it back into those Krebs cycle chains. So, high fat versus high carbohydrate diets. There's a lot of bad information on this. On here it says, high fat intake creates high circulating free fatty acids, which is good. But it also creates low glycogen storage, which is bad. So it's not necessarily true. It says there's no conclusive evidence on high-fat diets. There is. This is in a very narrow scope. What they're looking at is just a certain few things, such as high-performance sports. Is it going to be helpful in a sport like football or basketball or volleyball? No. Is it going to be helpful for marathoners and people that hit those walls? Almost definitely. But there's also some other evidence that's not being presented here, which is unfortunate. And that's the health aspects. They've already figured out that Alzheimer's disease is a type of diabetes. Specifically, they're looking to reclassify it as type 3 diabetes. And a high-fat, low-carb diet can cure Alzheimer's. It can actually stop the degradation of Alzheimer's. There's also types of epilepsy. The body or your brain runs in that big bath of sugar. Well, this helps perpetuate that electrical storm that causes epilepsy. If you can teach your brain to run on ketones, which it can, and it runs on fats, then you can stop types of epilepsy. So ketogenic diets have been shown to be very good for many, many conditions. Plus, humans get so much sugar that even on super low sugars, we have so much stored up from our fats that we don't actually run out of blood glucose. So, is it a bad thing? Probably not. And as far as low glycogen stores, we don't necessarily need the glycogen stores when we're completely running on free fatty acids, for the simple fact of we don't run out of fat. We have huge stores. So while your glycogen stores are low, your adipose, your free fats, there's plenty of that to go around. Okay, protein. Protein is essential for a lot of body functions. Cell structure, cell growth, repair, maintenance, and not just for your muscles, lots of other functions too. We make enzymes out of proteins. We make hormones out of proteins. We make antibodies. We make buffer. They control the plasma volume. It creates oncotic pressure. And all the proteins come down to 20 amino acids, essential and non-essential. And all that part of essential and non-essential is whether or not you can make it or you have to eat it. So protein consumption should be 15% of your daily kilocalories. Once again, this is a generic, general RDA kind of thing. That number can change based on what kind of athlete you are, whether or not you're doing strength training. If you're a high volume hypertrophy phase person right now, that number is going to have to be higher. If you're a marathon runner, even you're going to need protein because that wearing down on your muscles, they need to be repaired. So 0.8 grams per kilo per day. This is in pounds this time. Once again, this book keeps switching its numbers. A minute ago it said 1.8 grams per kilo. But it's around 0.8 to 1.2 per pound or 1.8 to 2.2 per kilo. So this is just a list of all 20 amino acids. Leucine on the left side, that's one that's really important. You have to have about 5 grams of leucine a day to start protein synthesis. This is what really helps key in onto your muscular development and your muscular repair. Specifically, it really helps with hypertrophy. So if you're taking supplements, protein supplements, that's a great one. Make sure you have enough of. Isoleucine, right above it, it's a conversion form of leucine. It's not quite as good because it hasn't converted. It's that left side, right side for those of you who do organic chemistry. But that's one you definitely want to look for going into physiology is leucine. Leucine will help muscular development. So protein requirements are higher for athletes. 1.2 to 1.7 grams per kilo. Still really, really low. The actual number should be 1.2 to 1.7 grams per pound. I'm not sure why this particular book keeps putting kilos, but it's not correct. Endurance training, protein is a possible fuel substrate. It's not. We went over this earlier in class. Once you look through the entirety of the Krebs cycle, amino acids and nitrogen fuels have virtually no benefit as a fuel substrate. Protein is either used, made into muscle, made into a steroid, made into a hormone, or it is converted into sugars where it is then used as a sugar or made in or stored into fat. Strength training, this one's obvious. You tear up your muscles, you got all the little holes. We need those aminos. We need to fill those holes and we need to repair those muscles. Excessive protein intake is health risks. This is one I've heard a lot over the years, and being in medicine, I have looked plenty into the actual research too. Excessive is a word there that is understated by a lot. If you have normal functioning kidneys, the odds that you are eating enough protein to get protein poisoning are virtually none. You have to binge gouge yourself on just stupid steak contest kind of things. But if you have functioning kidneys, you don't need to worry about getting nitrogen poisoning, getting protein poisoning. Your kidneys are plenty functional at filtering the protein and storing it and processing it and converting it as needed. So as long as you're a healthy person with good functioning kidneys, you don't need to worry about your protein intake. Not unless you start doing like 1,000 grams a day or something. And carbohydrate and protein after exercise has been shown to improve glycogen and muscle protein synthesis. Pretty common one. Most people know the 30-minute anabolic window. Get your protein, get your carbs, get your proteins into your muscles because the carbs want to go back into the muscles, so they help it go a little bit. Is the protein window true? Yeah, it actually is. 30 minutes is shown to be the ideal time to get this done. Even though we do most of our repairs and stuff at night, getting the substrates in there is what makes the difference. Now, if you don't do the 30-minute window, it's going to have a massive impact. It depends on your definition, massive. 5 to 10% would be about the difference. To the average person, if you only work out a few times a week or barely at all, you're not really going to notice a difference. But if you're one of the guys that hits the gym a lot, 5 or 10%, year after year after year, that is huge changes. All right, so let's get into the vitamins and minerals. So vitamins, what are they? Well, they're small, but they're essential organic molecules. They enable the use of other ingested nutrients, and mostly they act as a catalyst and a cofactor for chemical reactions. So we've got two different types. There's fat soluble and water soluble, just like there are in most of the hormones and steroids and everything else. So fat soluble, it can be stored and it can possibly be toxic. The reason you don't get rid of it every day. So if you take in large amounts, they can be toxic. Vitamin K is one that's particularly known to be a problem because if you take enough vitamin K, it can actually thicken your blood, and the more your blood gets thick, it can cause issues. We've covered those issues plenty of times. So this goes back to your same low hematocrit kind of problems where you've got stroke and cardiac issues. Water soluble is very, very hard to become toxic because, quite honestly, you get too much, you just pee it out. This is another one that a lot of the supplement companies are fun to tell you. Things like vitamin C cures colds, which of course is ridiculous. But they can sell you tons and tons of it with very little repercussion because you drink 5,000% of what you needed and all of a sudden you go pee and it's all gone. So to them, there was no harm. In general, unless you're vitamin deficient though, supplementation doesn't do anything. The one vitamin that has been shown to have a lot of need in the current population is vitamin D. But why vitamin D? It has so many important functions in your body, but it's mostly made by getting enough natural sunlight, and in modern ages, we're not outside farming anymore. We're not outside working in the sun very much, so most people are inside in buildings most of the day, so we don't produce the vitamin D we used to. All right, B complex. Very famous for energy, right? Essential for cellular metabolism, ATP production, needed for pyruvate, acetylcholine, formation of FAD and NADP, and erythropoiesis. Vitamin C, important for collagen maintenance, antioxidants. It's also good for adrenal hormone synthesis, and for ladies that are having issues with low iron, vitamin C can help with your iron absorption. Vitamin E, this is the one that's going to be stored in your muscles and fat. Potentially, it's an antioxidant. So, quick medical lesson there in case you don't know what antioxidants are. There is a lot of words you hear on TV. They throw it around a lot, antioxidant. What an antioxidant does is it can help hunt and kill or neutralize what is called free radicals. Free radicals are basically like ions. So when something has a positive and negative charge, it becomes ionic. Inside your body, there are certain changes that can happen. And if one of these, say DNA strands or some kind of other molecule becomes a free radical, it can be cancer producing. So vitamin E helps neutralize the free radicals that could cause cancer. Minerals. Minerals are inorganic substances that are used for cellular function. Macrominerals and microminerals, once again, this is just going to be size. So calcium, we know what calcium is good for, right? Bone density. It's for nerve function, muscle function. We've got that entire, calcium binding, troponin, all of that for your muscles that we should have learned many, many times. Issues, if you don't have enough calcium intake, you're going to pull it from your bones. You're going to get osteopenia, osteoporosis, right? What does that mean? That your bones are going to get weak. And then, of course, porosis, meaning like pores, you're going to have holes in your bones. So quite easily, they're going to break. Phosphorus, this binds to the calcium in the bones. It's also very important for metabolism, cellular membranes, buffering systems, bioenergetics. Iron is critical for hemoglobin, right? It is iron. Myoglobin, same thing. It's basically an iron magnet inside your muscles that grabs that oxygen off hemoglobin, pulls it in there. So not enough iron, you actually don't have enough oxygen going through your system. What happens when you don't have enough of the iron? You get deficient, you get anemic. So you might have enough blood, but it's not transporting oxygen. And if you get too much of it, it's toxic. Now, coincidentally here, those two tend to be gender specific and opposite. Females, for obvious reasons, such as you have periods and other osteo issues that men don't tend to have, you will more likely become anemic, so females are quite often put on iron supplements. Men, on the other hand, have no way to dump that excess iron. So one of the things that can be really dangerous is if you get a male taking vitamins with iron supplements, you can actually get iron toxicity. And that includes multivitamins, so you have to check those. Sodium potassium chloride. Well, together, that's what makes up a lethal injection. So that's something that you want to space out a little bit in there. Sodium and chloride are primarily found into your interstitial fluids. And then potassium, which is K+, that's in the intracellular fluids. And what you are needing these for is for your nerve impulses, for those cardiac rhythms, for those fluid and pH balances. They're fantastic electrical buffer conductors. So they help get those charges across. They maintain those rhythms. Plus, we need them for those things like the sodium potassium ion pump that actually moves that electrical charge. Well, excess of this intake is dangerous, right? Obviously, I just said that sodium potassium chloride is lethal injection. That's what you actually give somebody, sodium and potassium chloride. So yeah, if you was to take too much of these as a supplement, you're ingesting large amounts of lethal injection. Water and electrolyte balance. So you need your body water 50 to 60% of your total weight. Fat-free mass is almost 73% water. Fat mass is only about 10% water. We did the math before, how fat was 9 kcals per gram. And if you did the math all the way out, converted it back to pounds, it comes out to be about 4,200 kcals to get rid of a true pound of fat. And I told you 3,500 is a pound. That's because about 90% of that weight is fat. The other 10% was just water. It just falls off. Well, water has a lot of great functions for your actual system, especially for your muscles. Lubrication, being able to enhance the contractile speed because it's giving it less frictional resistance. So it's important to maintain a high body water weight. So 1 to 6% of body weight loss in sweat, that's common. So you can actually lose around 5% of your body weight just by working out hard. You don't want to go super high. If you double that, it's probably fatal. 9% is possibly fatal. 12% you're probably going into heat stroke. 2/3 of the body water is intracellular, and then 1/3 of it is outside, is extracellular. Water, of course, also offers a great medium for transportation, diffusion, temperature regulation, blood pressure maintenance. We got to remember that a large amount of our blood is plasma, and the plasma is virtually just water with some electrolytes in it. So water gain at rest, it's about 33 milliliters per kilogram per day. We get about 60% of our water from drinking water. We actually get about 30% of our water from food. So you can actually maintain a good amount of your fluids from actual eating. We also get 10% from cellular respiration. That respiration cycle going on and exchanging down in our actual cellular levels can produce and release water. We did the sodium bicarb buffer system. One of the byproducts of that is water. And water loss when we're at rest. Just evaporation from your skin and our respiratory tract. So breathing, 30%. Excretion from our kidneys, so needing to go pee, 60%. From our large intestines, 5%. And sweat, we only lose about 5% of our daily water at rest from sweat. Even when you don't think you're sweating, just being mildly uncomfortable at all, your skin can let off very small sweat molecules to help keep itself cool. During exercise, of course, sweat levels go up a lot because of the body temperature. We need to get that evaporation effect going. So then we have a large amount of water loss, and it can be a lot more than any water gain, right? So it's important that you keep yourself hydrated to try to compensate that and keep your body temperature down. Factors in the body temperature and the sweating, you have environmental temperatures and that radiant heat load. So sitting on hot things or radiation itself, meaning that sun radiant. The humidity outside, this can cause all kinds of different issues. If it's too hot and too humid, then you're so covered with water, you can't even cool down. So even though you might be sweating, there's so much water already on you that you can't get the body heat down. Air velocity. Wind is good. Wind makes you feel cooler. Body size. Big guys sweat. And your metabolic rate. You have a high metabolism, you're going to produce more heat. You're going to produce more heat, you're going to sweat more. What else is not really factored into this, which we've discussed in the last chapter, into the temperature chapter, is the fact that being well conditioned for heat, being acclimated to heat. Remember, you're going to sweat more, and you're going to sweat earlier, and you're going to sweat less electrolytes when you're conditioned to be worked into a hot environment. So typical values of water loss from body at rest in a cool environment and during prolonged. So on the left side, you see where the source of loss is. The ones you're really going to concentrate on, though, is sweating and respiration, because those are the two that increase the most during exercise. So sweating, you see he's losing 4 mils an hour. And then on the right side, he goes to 1,200 mils an hour. It jumps from 5 to 91%. Respiration, it goes from 15 to 100 mils. Now notice it does technically drop from 15 to 7%, but that's only because sweating went up so much. Even though the percents technically had gone down, it is still 7 times higher than it was when you were at rest. So respiration has gone up about 7 times, and sweating has gone up 300 times. So where's water gain at rest? Fluid intake 60, food intake 30, metabolic production 10. Then water loss at rest, 30% skin, 5% sweat, the other 65% bodily functions. Then where does it change? Water loss during exercise, sweating, and then insensible water loss is just some random factors. The other one that should really be on there, though, is respiration, because you're breathing off a lot of water because of that acid buffer system. So water and electrolyte balance impairs aerobic performance, because when your temperature goes up, you increase your sweat. When you increase your sweat, you're dehydrating yourself, so you're going to have a lower performance. You're going to have a lower plasma volume, which is going to have lower cardiovascular function, and lower cardiovascular function is going to have lower thermoregulatory function. Why? Because we sweat, our blood plasma goes down, so our blood volume goes down. So the amount of blood we're circulating goes down, and it's not able to go across those muscles as much, so it's not going to pick up all that extra heat. So the effect of that dehydration on anaerobic and strength is kind of unclear. Why? Because they're such short, powerful bursts that we don't know if it has much of an impact. We know it's not going to matter for things like thermoregulatory function, because you're only going to be working a few seconds. You don't really need to worry about getting hot. Take the extreme case of a power lifter. In 6 seconds, he's done, and he's not going up again for another 6, 7, 8 minutes. Electrolytes lost in sweat. So sweat is very similar to what is in plasma. And if you're not sure, basically it's the medical equivalent. We call it lactate ringer, but the generic version would be sugar-free Gatorade. Mostly it's going to be sodium and chloride. So salt and chlorine. Sodium is, of course, all the salt. It gives it that sticky kind of feel. Chlorine helps give it that awful smell. Not to mention, it doesn't also say it, but literally urea. So a lot of the toxins that would go out in pee, when you're trying to push them out, you will shove them out your skin. Electrolytes lost in urine. So the kidneys are going to regulate that electrolyte excretion. During exercise, of course, we're going to have lower urine production, so you're going to not lose as much electrolytes that way. But then you have aldosterone. Aldosterone is great. It's released by the kidneys, and it tells your body to retain that sodium. What's that mean? If you're retaining sodium, you're decreasing your urine production. You're also going to retain as much water as possible. Part of that's going to be increasing your thirst and your drinking, and then it's going to bind with that sodium and it's going to stay in your blood. So electrolyte concentrations on osmolarity in sweat, plasma, and muscles of men following 2 hours to exercise and heat. So what you see across the top, you have your sodium, your chlorine, your potassium, and Mg2 is magnesium. And osmolarity, that's that osmosis. That's that moving of water across barriers. So sweat, in 2 hours, we have 40 to 60. Chlorine went 30, 50. 4, 6 on K, and then 1.5 to 5 on mag. So we start with 80 to 185. Now you see the plasma, it is very heavy on that sodium and that chlorine. Not so much on that potassium and that magnesium. Muscle works the other way. It's really heavy on that magnesium and that potassium, but not so much on that sodium and that chlorine. So thirst, this comes from osmoreceptors, high blood osmolarity, and baroreceptors, which come in when there's a low blood volume. Thirst is known to not be well hydrated or calibrated to hydration. What does this mean? The golden saying is, by the time you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. So you should have already been drinking water before then. Benefits of fluid during exercise. They minimize dehydration and water loss. So if you're drinking the whole time, you're less likely to actually get to the stage of being dehydrated. And it maintains performance and cardiovascular function. You're losing water, you're replacing water. You keep the cycle going at a nice homeostasis, you can keep performing. Because otherwise it takes you about 2 full days after an event of just standard drinking to be able to replenish all the lost dehydration levels. So here we have water, saline, and no fluid, and you can see this is your heart rate and what happens, and this is time on the bottom. So the amount of hours, basically we're doing exercise, and what happens to our heart rate at given fluids. So we give ourselves plain water, where we start about 135, 130, somewhere in that. They all start about 130. After 6 hours, we're up to about 135. So raise 2, 3, 4 beats a minute. Saline, which is supplemented, usually IV. I doubt they were giving these people salt water to drink. That would be silly, I hope. But they're starting at about 132 also. After 6 hours, he's at 140. So even though it was given probably artificially IV, it was still not quite as effective as just drinking water. And then no fluid. Also starts 130. He actually starts the lowest. And then at hour 5, he is at 165. Now I notice he doesn't have an hour 6, but judging by that cardiology rate, I'm gonna guess he was either medically stopped because of that very steep incline, or he just couldn't keep going. So electrolyte imbalances, hyponatremia. Natremia is fancy word for salt, Na, and then hypo, of course, being low. So this is excessive sodium lost during rehydration. Mostly you've lost a lot of water, or you've lost a lot of sodium while you were sweating, and you haven't been replacing it. So too much water, not enough Gatorade. It's pretty rare. You have to run for like 7 hours or something crazy before that's going to happen most of the time. Symptoms: bloating, puffiness, nausea, vomiting, headache. So even though those are considered mild, medical person would put that in the severe category. Once you see the nausea, vomiting, headache, you start to suspect some kind of heat sickness or something of that nature. More severe, life-threatening. These are life-threatening. I'd call them severe. Cerebral edema, that is swelling on the brain. Cognitive or central nervous dysfunction. So your brain and your spine have stopped working correctly. Pulmonary edema, that is fluid in the lungs. Coma and death. I have just realized that they could consider death slightly more severe. Fluid and electrolyte balance for replacement guidelines. So before a 2 hour, you start with a solid 400, 600 mil bolus. You basically just drink a, half liter. During exercise, you keep your intake to about 2% of your pre-exercise body weight. So you don't want to overdrink, you don't want to underdrink. Unfortunately, the way to regulate this with body weight requires literal scales and usually being dry and out of uniform. So practicality is a little complicated, unfortunately. And after you replace all of your fluid losses, salty snacks, this is the only time the Gatorade stuff is really good, is once you've started sweating profusely into an event, and then after. If you're not exercising, you're just overloading yourself with electrolytes. All right, so some of these athletic diets, we'll start with some of them. Vegetarian diets. There are 100 different names. Vegan, lacto-ovo. I can't even remember the word for fish. It's like pescatarian or something. I can't remember. Lacto-ovo, fewer nutrient deficiencies. So this is people that are vegetarian, but they drink milk and they eat eggs. Ovo is egg, like ovary, and lacto, like lactose, milk. Fewer deficiencies. Why? Because those essential amino acids, by essential, it means we need to eat it. If we don't eat it, we don't have it. And there are, despite what some of the popular vegans say, you cannot get all your proteins from beans and soy and grass. You actually have to eat meat or meat products. Leucine, one of the most important ones, it comes from muscles. You absorb it from other muscles. So vitamin A, riboflavin, vitamin B12, vitamin D, Ca2+, zinc, iron. These are all essential amino acids and minerals that you have to intake. So what should a pre-competition meal look like? 200 to 500 kcals 2 hours before, mostly carbs. Cereal, milk, juice, toast, and liquid meals. Yeah. Maximum glycogen stores, maximum performance, right? We want to have those muscles fully loaded with the sugars. That way we're good to go. Training tapering during week events, meaning as we're going into the event, we're going to go less and less intense. So 6 to 4 days before, we're going to go with a normal carb diet. 3 days or so, we're going to start eating high carb diets every day. And then we're going to try to double those muscle glycogen stores. Also a pretty big trick for people that do photo shoots. Makes your muscles big and puffed up and makes you look lean right before the event. So here we have red, we have a normal mixed diet, green is a low carb diet, and then blue is a high carb diet. So you can see here we have your normal low carb diet. He starts low, but 3 days before he starts pumping high carbs. Normally he's living low on carbs. Red, he's eating a normal diet, so he's already pretty good. But same thing, 3 days before he starts pumping the high carbs. Coincidentally, in this particular case, the low carb guy actually ended up higher, but what the science shows, for the most part, they're not statistically significant. Basically, if you start carb loading 3 or 4 days before the event, you start going high carb, you're going to max store no matter what your diet looks like. So preparing your liver for endurance exercise, and no, that is not binge drinking. Carbohydrates loaded greatly increase liver glycogens, which is going to reduce hypoglycemia. Why? Because liver's that last hold on. He likes to hold on normal days about 540, 500 kcals of glucose. He's that emergency store. He stores 1 gram of glycogen with 2.6 grams of water. So when you carb load glycogen, you're going to have water weight gain. So back-to-back competitions, your liver glycogen is resynthesized quick. Your muscle glycogen is resynthesized slow. Unfortunately, what's not put in here is liver glycogen is usually about 500 calories. Muscle glycogen is usually about 2,000 calories. So it is 4 times bigger in your muscles. But you have high carbohydrate and protein intake within 2 hours of your competition. That's how you're going to get those glycogen levels the highest, especially putting the carbs and the proteins together. It'll rush for your muscles. All right, nice little crisscross graph here. Glycogen synthase and glycogen itself. And on the bottom is the days after a marathon. Left side, we have your muscle glycogen levels. And right side, we have your glycogen synthesis levels. So as you can see, we started right before a marathon, super high. We had no reason to synthesis. We ran, we run to the ground, glycogen's dead, and all of a sudden synthesis spikes. And then synthesis is going to slowly go down as the glycogen stores slowly go up. So they're just going to work in a kind of a perfect imbalance, or perfect inverse balance. We're going to synthesize what we need. We're going to run that synthase, which is that enzyme, and we're just going to work in opposite of our stores. So what about sports drinks? Gatorade, right? Made famous by University of Florida Gators to help their football team win. So what are sports drinks? Most of them are water, carbohydrates, and electrolytes. And they have some good widespread performance when taken properly. So the carbohydrate concentration, it tends to be pretty optimal. They put a lot of science into it, into delivering the right amount of energy. The carbohydrate content slows that gastric emptying. And most of the drinks have 6 or 8 grams per 100 mils. And the source is mostly simple glucose. So just basic sugars. And that gives you about 30 to 60 carbs per hour of competition. Once again, though, this is for when you actually are exercising and you're already losing electrolytes to sweat, or you're starting to lose electrolytes to sweat. If you're taking it and you're drinking it all the time, just sitting around the classroom, those electrolytes start to build up. They start to cause water gain. They start to cause bloat, discomfort, and they're actually not very healthy for you. The sodium in it, it acts as a rehydrator, right? You have the glucose in there, then you dump in the salt and you're drinking it with water. So it's going to help refill the water and refill the glycogen. And the sodium is going to increase that thirst and palatability, which means being able to like the taste of what you're drinking. The sodium is also going to retain and promote water retention, and it's going to give you about 20 to 60 millimoles per liter for that. Palatability, generally you want them to have light flavor, so it could be orange flavored but barely, and no strong aftertaste. So it's going to help you to actually drink large amounts of it. It's also pretty popular to keep it more of a room temperature than cold for the same reason. You drink a lot more room temperature water than you do cold water. And it's going to add to your ad libitum consumption. All right, that's the end for these body composition and metabolics. So if you have any questions, you can reach me by email. I'll try to set up a Zoom meeting later this week, so if anybody wants any tutoring or lessons on anything. And I'll see you all back whenever I get back from my alien abduction, Bigfoot kidnapping, or time hole experience, depending on which excuse I gave you. All right, have a good day.